Dove nasce l'innovazione? È un salto nel vuoto, da colmare con le giuste risposte. Servizio tecnico, soluzioni integrate e spirito innovativo è il nostro tratto distintivo. Industry Automation, Energy e Lighting Solutions, quello che facciamo. Tecnologie, soluzioni, competenze, quello che forniamo. Tutto ciò che serve per entrare nel futuro. Formazione ai professionisti con il progetto Academy. Evoluzione tecnologica con il network di Ginnova. Supporto al territorio e cura delle persone con la community. La nostra è una lunga storia di innovazione continua per i clienti, per i collaboratori, per la comunità, per creare valore ovunque andiamo, guidando le persone e le aziende verso nuove direzioni nello sviluppo del proprio potenziale. Per guardare al futuro e fare un passo oltre, dentro l'innovazione, di chi ha l'innovazione dentro. Benvenuti in Telmotor.
Buon pomeriggio.
Good afternoon. My name is Isabella and I'm a member of the BergamoScienza Youth. Before starting, I'd like to focus your attention on the fact that connecting to the site bergamoscienza.it and clicking on the live button, you can post on Facebook and Twitter the live streaming of the event, send questions to the speakers, or invite your friends to follow the conference online. The questions from the web will be received by us, the volunteers, and we'll be selecting a few for the question and answer session. For simultaneous translation, you can scan the QR code that you can find on the doors of the room or projected behind me. And the QR code will address you directly to Converso web app, where you can select the language you want to follow from the drop-down menu. For listening to the translation, you need a pair of earphones. You're kindly invited to use your own. Those who are not provided with them can ask the volunteers. Welcome to today's event, Know Thyself, the Science of Self-Awareness. The speaker is Steve Fleming from the University College of London. The conference will be moderated by Stefano Cappa. Please mute your smartphones and participate in BergamoScienza's initiatives, very numerous. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy the conference. Welcome to today's meeting. Stefano Cappa is not here. Unfortunately could not attend for previous commitments, so I'll try and replace him. Today's meeting is entitled Know Thyself, and I believe from the audience that this is something we're all very much interested in, also because it is part of our general culture. In Delphi's Apollo's temple, even though you were not there and you don't remember what you studied at school, you might have watched Matrix, and you remember that in the oracle's kitchen there is the sentence, know thyself. The idea that knowing ourselves, knowing how to read ourselves is definitely a rich resource that allows us to perform cognitive tasks, the ability to answer questions, to solve problems. We can do it better if we are aware of what we know, what we do not know, what we can do, what we can't do, the knowing ourselves so we can understand how we react with others, interacting with others. This makes us more efficient. But all these ideas are part of our common experience but they are not necessarily scientifically true. And to ask the questions, how important it is to know ourselves, in what ways is this helping us, who is else capable of knowing themselves, can animals know themselves, can AI know itself in the future? All these questions, some can be answered today, others might be answered tomorrow, are scientific questions. And tonight we will be understanding more about this scientific research, because here with us Steve Fleming, who is one of the world experts in this field, and who can help us drawing a line between science and speculation, because these are the questions that we just posed and that might have a scientific answer. Thank you, Steve Fleming, for being here with us today. And I'll shortly cover his biography, then I leave the floor to him, and then there's going to be a question and answer session, hopefully a lot of questions. Steve Fleming is professor of experimental psychology at University College of London, and at UCL is also director of his laboratory that deals with metacognition studies within the Wellcome Center for Human Neuroimaging. Before becoming an independent scientist, a renowned scientist in this field, because he founded this research field. Of course, he studied at Oxford University, experimental psychology. He got his Bachelor of Arts, and then his PhD was at UCL, where he is currently teaching, and also spent 4 years at New York University, where he dealt with the studies on models, computational models that can allow us to understand what's taking place in our brain, trying to model what is taking place within our brain by means of these metacognitive processes. And this is paramount, because when you want to be scientific on this field, first you must measure things, and we spoke about this when we spoke about plant intelligence. We can be doing science when we can measure things, and I'll be quoting 3 themes because there are too many. Awards and not themes. The Philip Prize in Psychology, a Sperman Medal from the British Psychological Society, and Francis Crick, a medal by the Royal Society. Now I leave the floor to Steve Fleming. He'll be covering his own science. Thank you very much.
Grazie, Nicola. And thank you for coming along. It's wonderful to be here in Bergamo at the Scienza. So I am a psychologist and neuroscientist, and we are interested in understanding how humans think about the world. But perhaps uniquely among other animal species, humans are also able to think about ourselves. We might reflect on whether we have made a mistake. We might think, is my memory accurate? Am I giving a good talk? So humans have this remarkable capacity for self-awareness. And as Nicola said, this is not a new idea. For hundreds, if not thousands of years, scholars have wondered about the importance of self-awareness. They've advised us to strive towards having better self-knowledge. So in Plato, we read that the wise or temperate man will know himself and be able to examine what he does and does not know. In Eastern traditions, Lao Tzu, to know that one does not know is best. Not to know, but to believe that one knows is a disease. And fast forward a few hundred years, the biologist Carl Linnaeus, when he was putting together his famous taxonomy of the species, annotated Homo sapiens with nosce te ipsum, he who knows himself. But it's only recently, in the past 50 years or so, that psychologists have started to have the tools to study the mechanisms of self-awareness in the lab. And this is what we call metacognition, or thinking about our own thinking. So imagine you're revising for an upcoming exam. You might think to yourself, do I know this topic well enough? So you're making a metacognitive judgment. You're reflecting on whether you know enough. And if you decide you don't know enough, that can prompt you to search out new information. Or in a completely different domain, in the domain of perception, imagine you go to the opticians for an eye test, and you might be asked, are you seeing the charts clearly or not? And what you're being asked there is to judge your own perception. It's not as if the world is blurry or clear. It's the fact that your visual system is making it blurry or clear. And if you realize that you're not seeing the world clearly, then you can correct it, get a new pair of glasses. So it's clear that having good metacognition allows us to perhaps compensate for cognitive or physical limitations. Now, as Nicola said, we need to be able to quantify, to measure metacognition if we want to develop a science of self-awareness. And the way that we have been approaching this question is to measure people's behavior in the laboratory, asking people to carry out different tasks, investigating memory, perception, decision-making. And then we also ask them a metacognitive judgment. How confident are you in getting the answer right on that task? And typically we do this in very well-controlled tasks involving judgments of very simple stimuli. So we might ask you to make a decision about whether this image is a face or a house. And we make it difficult so that you sometimes make errors on this task. And we then ask you this metacognitive question: how confident are you? Or do you think you might have made an error? And when we have lots of these judgments over time, then we can quantify statistical associations between your performance and your metacognition. So intuitively, if you're confident when you're right and less confident when you're wrong, then that's an indication for us as experimenters that you have good metacognition. So I just want to give you a sense of what this data looks like. So this is data from one of our experiments, from one individual in the lab, performing a few judgments like this. The task that they were asked to carry out was to decide whether a first or second presentation of a stimulus was slightly brighter. And we made this a difficult task, so they sometimes made errors. And then, after every judgment, they were asked to say how confident they were in their decision. And what you can see on the screen is the top row shows their accuracy on each trial. So sometimes they're getting it right, accuracy is 1, and sometimes they're getting it wrong, their accuracy is 0. And then the bottom row shows their confidence that's fluctuating from trial to trial. And when we take these two vectors and correlate them together, we get a measure that we call metacognitive efficiency. So if your confidence tends to go up when you're correct, and your confidence tends to go down when you're wrong, that tells us that you are able to know when you're right and know when you are wrong. And what we found is that people have surprisingly stable metacognitive fingerprints. Some people might perform the task quite well, but are unaware of how well they are doing. They have poor metacognition. Whereas other people might be acutely aware of their mistakes. They might know when they've got a right answer or know when they're wrong. And we found that this is a
actually the opposite. Like the older we get, the more confident we became. Because sometimes you have this sensation that when you, I mean, I'm becoming old, but when you talk to people which are older than me, maybe they are less inclined to change, to think that they are maybe wrong. So, stavo chiedendo che a me sembra che invece sia il contrario, perché a volte sembra che invecchiando siamo meno disposti a pensare di avere torto o pensiamo di avere più.
So our data suggests that people, it actually goes the opposite way. People tend to be more aware of making mistakes as they get older. And one exception is in cases of brain disorders like dementia, then metacognition can come apart from performance. So there people might, for instance, think that their memory is functioning well when it is not. And that can create problems with seeking help, adhering to medication, and the connection between yourself and your family might become, what they see might be different from the way that you see yourself.
Okay, so aging is not a problem per se, but maybe neurological diseases that occur with aging.
That's right.
Ok, è tornato. Sento anche delle voci in sottofondo, quindi credo che funzioni.
I believe now the sound has come back, so you can go ahead with your presentation.
Grazie a tutti per la pazienza, a tutte e a tutti. Mi taccio di nuovo.
Okay, well, thank you for your patience. And this was a very good question to lead on to the next couple of points I wanted to make. So the first one is that in our studies of hundreds of individuals in the lab, we found that metacognition is not the same thing as intelligence. So when we measure people's IQ and we measure your metacognition, these things are uncorrelated in the healthy population. So that means that someone might be quite smart but have limited self-awareness. And as we just discussed with Nicola, a number of studies now show that metacognitive capacity is maintained into older age, even if other functions may become impaired. But there are also a number of disorders of mental health and brain disorders such as dementia, where self-beliefs might decouple from reality. So people who have more anxiety or depression may think that they are unable to carry out certain tasks when the reality is very different. In educational settings, we know that there are gender differences in metacognition. So boys may think that they are better at STEM subjects than girls, even though there is no difference in ability, but this can create problems with what they choose to study. And as we also just discussed, self-awareness is fragile because inaccurate metacognition about cognitive and physical impairments is a common feature of a number of psychiatric and neurological disorders. And clinicians often refer to this as lacking insight. So a patient might have a particular problem but not be aware of having that problem. And that could create problems with seeking help or adhering to medication. So one major focus of the research in my lab in London is trying to understand what is it about the brain that gives us this rich metacognitive capacity. So this is part of what's known as cognitive neuroscience, the scientific study of the biological and computational processes underlying how the human mind works. So a lot of what we do in the lab is coming up with new ways of quantifying different mental functions. And we also spend a lot of time writing computer programs that can simulate those functions. And that helps us understand what kind of brain processes might implement functions like metacognition. So my lab is one of several in the Wellcome Center for Human Neuroimaging in Queen Square in London. This image on the left is a cross-section through our townhouse in Queen Square where we're based. And the basement of our building contains a number of brain imaging machines. And the groups in the center study different aspects of how the mind works, from seeing and hearing to memory. And our group is the one on the bottom here, studying self-awareness. And we are interested in how do the raw materials of the brain, these amazingly complicated neuronal circuits, give rise to human mental function. Now, in humans, we can't study individual neurons apart from in rare cases, but we can use non-invasive tools such as MEG or fMRI to study brain function. So MEG measures small changes in the magnetic and electrical field around the head, and fMRI measures small changes in the oxygenation level of the blood. And we know that this is a proxy of how much neurons in that area of the brain are firing. And so we can combine these measures with tasks that we give people to do in the scanner that measure their metacognition. And when we do this, we find something pretty striking. So when we ask people in the scanner to think about how they are performing a task, we see reliable activation in two key regions of the brain. In the prefrontal cortex, on the left side of this image, and also in the medial parietal cortex, also known as the precuneus. And these regions are interesting because they are part of a network that is very deep in the brain. It's very far away from sensory regions of the brain, processing vision and hearing and touch. And they are also far away from motor regions of the brain. So we think that they are involved in essentially building a model of how other aspects of our mind are working. And these regions also respond when we make errors on tasks, even though we haven't been told we have made an error. So this is what psychologists call, in the EEG signal, the error-related negativity. And this is a key component of self-monitoring. If you have a part of the brain that can recognize that you have made an error, then that's a key building block of good metacognition. And another interesting fact about these regions is that they're not only involved in thinking about yourself, they're also involved when we think about other people. And one interesting hypothesis about the origins of metacognition is that we may have learned to apply the resources we have for thinking about other people to ourselves. So self-awareness might have emerged in evolutionary history as a byproduct of social cognition. There's one other important part of the human brain for metacognition, and that's the frontopolar cortex, right towards the front of the prefrontal cortex. And we found across a number of studies that people with better metacognition show enhanced structure, function, and connectivity in this part of the brain. And this part of the brain, right towards the front of the prefrontal cortex, is particularly expanded in humans compared to non-human primate species. And in fact, researchers in Oxford have found that the lateral frontopolar cortex, at the sides of the prefrontal cortex, have new specializations that we cannot detect in the non-human primate brain. We also know from clinical studies that damage to the anterior prefrontal cortex impairs metacognition and self-awareness. So this graph on the bottom right here shows some data from a study that I conducted when I was a postdoc in New York at NYU. And we studied patients who had selective damage to these regions of the frontopolar cortex because they had surgery for removal of a tumor there. And we found that their cognition and behavior was just as good as control subjects. But when we measured their metacognition, it was around half as good as the control patients. And clinicians refer to this as the frontal lobe paradox, because you might actually have brain damage to these regions that doesn't show up on standard clinical tests. And yet, you may still have quite profound changes in self-awareness. So people might have changes in their cognitive or physical capacities without being aware of it. Now, even in otherwise healthy brains, you might temporarily experience this paradox of frontal lobe function if you are under heavy stress, because we know that stress can impair prefrontal function and lead to lower metacognition temporarily. So next time you're in a stressful situation at work, perhaps think, is my self-awareness, is my metacognition becoming impaired? Might it be better to take a step back and allow myself to monitor how I am doing? So far I've talked about metacognition as being a relatively stable feature of the mind, one that's grounded in brain function. But that doesn't mean it's fixed. We know that various interventions, various life experiences can change our metacognition. Studies have shown that engaging in regular meditation practice can improve these laboratory markers of metacognitive function. Studies exploring different aspects of pharmacology, particularly ones using manipulations of noradrenaline and dopamine function, have shown benefits for metacognition. And in our lab, we've been interested in the promise of giving people regular feedback to train them to have better metacognition about how they are performing. Now, a natural question is, do we share metacognition with other animals? We know that the brain regions involved are particularly expanded in the human brain. And it used to be thought that self-awareness was uniquely human. In this quote from the novelist Vladimir Nabokov, he says, being aware of being aware of being. In other words, if I not only know that I am, but also know that I know it, then I belong to the human species. All the rest follows, the glory of thoughts, poetry, a vision of the universe. In that respect, the gap between ape and man is immeasurably greater than one between amoeba and ape. So Nabokov was suggesting here that there's a bright line between humans and other animals when it comes to self-awareness. But more recently, we've started to question that received wisdom. This is Jenny, an orangutan in London Zoo in the mid-19th century. And Jenny was visited by Charles Darwin. And Darwin wrote in his diaries that he was astonished by the reaction that Jenny had when he showed her a mirror. She seemed to recognize her own reflection. And more recently, that observation has been turned into a psychological test of self-awareness, known as the mirror test, by Gordon Gallup. And the mirror test is very simple. You put a mark on usually the forehead of the animal you want to test, and then you show them their reflection in the mirror. And if the animal reaches out to the mirror, to the unusual mark, then you can conclude that they think the impression in the mirror is someone else. But if they reach to their own face to rub off that mark, that suggests that they recognize their reflection. And this test has been applied to a number of species now, and several species pass this test, including human infants around the age of 2 years old, but also several species who are often thought of as being smart or intelligent, such as dogs and macaque monkeys, fail the test. So what does the mirror test really tell us? If an animal passes the mirror test, it tells us that they presumably have some perception of their own body. But does this mean they are self-aware? And I would argue that you also need to study metacognition in animals, because we want to know not only do they perceive their own body, but we also want to know, are they aware of their own minds? So how do we do this? Well, to do this, you need to develop non-verbal measures of metacognition. You can't ask an animal, how did they think they did on a test? But in some ingenious developments in animal cognition research, it's now possible to measure confidence in animals using betting procedures. And when this is done, a number of species now pass tests of metacognition, including monkeys, great apes, such as chimpanzees, rodents, and dolphins. So at least some animals share some building blocks of metacognition with humans. Nabokov's bright line is becoming blurred. But this leaves us with the opposite question. What then is perhaps unique about human self-awareness? And one way of studying this is by investigating the development of metacognition in children and babies. We know that 12-month-old infants show telltale signs of error responses in the EEG, this error-related negativity, when they look at the wrong objects on the screen. So that suggests that there are some initial signs of self-monitoring in the baby brain. And slightly older babies, 18 months old, search for a toy longer when they've chosen the right box compared to when they choose the wrong box. Again, suggesting that they have some telltale signs of being aware of when they're right or wrong. But while young infants might show these telltale signs of confidence in their behavior, there's a surprisingly long delay until the age of around 4, when children become able to tell us what they do and do not know. They're surprisingly bad at telling us how confident they are in different aspects of their knowledge. And metacognition continues to develop into adolescence. And this is associated with the continued development of these structures in the prefrontal cortex that brain imaging shows us don't fully mature until the early 20s. So what might be going on here? Well, one hypothesis is that thinking about ourselves requires this rich model of other people. And children acquire fully fledged self-awareness around the same age, 4 or 5 years old, as they become fluent at thinking about other people. And so the reason that it takes us a long time as children and adolescents to gain fully fledged self-awareness might be because that it is in humans a social and cultural phenomenon. One hypothesis put forward by my colleague Cecilia Hayes in Oxford is that capacities like self-awareness, like metacognition, are culturally inherited. Our teachers and our parents teach us to become self-aware. Not in the same way as they teach us to read, but in a more informal way. We might say to our kids, are you sure you are feeling sad? Perhaps you're feeling something different. You're teaching your child, without you realizing it, to become more self-aware. So this brings me to the last part of my presentation. Really the biggest question of all. Why are we self-aware? Why can we not just get away with these amazing cognitive and intellectual functions that we use in daily life? Why do we also have to think about ourselves doing those things? And one idea here is that you can think of metacognition a bit like the conductor of an orchestra. If the conductor was not there, the orchestra would continue to play. But a good conductor makes the difference between a routine rehearsal and a world-class performance. In the same way, you can think of metacognition as nudging the players of the mind in the right direction. And one perhaps vital function of metacognition is to enable collaboration and cooperation. Humans, uniquely among other animal species, have been able to cooperate on a grand scale, sending astronauts to the moon, developing vaccines, developing the field of science itself. And we think one major function for metacognition is enabling this collaboration. These two referees on the football pitch may well be sharing metacognitive information. Are you sure that you saw that correctly? Or perhaps I had a better view than you. We're reflecting on what we saw, what we know, and we're using those reflections to enable us to work with other people. And this goes all the way back to where we started, the ancient Greeks. The notion that good metacognition promotes a reflective mode of thinking. You might think to yourself, do I know this topic? Or should I seek advice from someone else? Am I seeing things clearly enough or not? Perhaps someone else has the answer, and perhaps I do not. And conversely, this suggests that poor metacognition might disrupt cooperation. And we've been studying this in a series of studies, a series of experiments recently, where we measured people's confidence in their political attitudes. And we found that that confidence was U-shaped in political orientation. So people on both the extreme right and extreme left of the political spectrum had more confidence that they were right and everyone else was wrong. But what's interesting is that those same individuals also showed slightly worse metacognition on our laboratory measures. More dogmatic or confident individuals were less likely to recognize when they might have been wrong and less likely to take on board corrective information. And this naturally creates an impediment to combining viewpoints when collaborating with others. And finally, we're increasingly collaborating not only with other people, but with artificial systems. So how might human metacognition impact on our collaboration with artificial intelligence? And what are the prospects for developing a form of metacognition in AI? Well, what we do know is that metacognition in AI is still developing. Early AI systems, such as deep neural networks, are very good in the domains that they're trained in. But when they're faced with systems that are situations that are outside of their training data, they're often too confident that they know the answer. For instance, in large language models like ChatGPT, OpenAI's report on ChatGPT says, ChatGPT can also be confidently wrong, not taking care to double-check work when it's likely to make a mistake. And what's very interesting here is that their original model had better metacognition, but after it was fine-tuned, after it was pre-trained, the metacognition started to become worse. And I think many of us might have had the experience of interacting with artificial intelligence systems and feeling like they are confidently giving us a response, which may well not be correct. And to try and address some of these problems, we've been collaborating with roboticists at Oxford University to try and find ways of building in human-like metacognition into machines to enable better collaboration. And in one of these recent studies we've been doing, we've been asking, how do people perceive the metacognition of AI? And what we asked was, how do people track the confidence of the artificial system? So when you watch an AI agent make a decision, how confident do you think that it is? And what we found was that even though the behavior of the other human and the other AI was identical, people had a systematic illusion of confidence and trust in the AI system. They were more likely to think it was confident, and they were more likely to trust it to make a better decision. And we found that this was the case across a number of different experiments. And this very last experiment in the bottom right here shows that people were more likely to take on board the advice of the AI than taking on board the advice of the human because they felt it was more confident. But this is an illusion, because our experiment made sure that the behavior of the two systems was identical. So just a few take-home messages from what I've said today. So self-awareness is a defining feature of what it means to be human. And recently we've begun to have the tools to study self-awareness in the psychology laboratory by measuring metacognition, how well your confidence tracks your performance. And there are differences in metacognition between people that are unrelated to general intelligence. You can actually be quite smart but have poor self-awareness, and vice versa. And self-awareness is grounded in the biology of the human brain and is fragile. It's susceptible to damage, disease, and stress, but it's also malleable, and we can improve it. And we share some of the building blocks of metacognition with other animals, but fully fledged self-awareness seems to be uniquely human and takes a long time to develop in childhood and adolescence. We saw towards the end there that current AI, even though it's stunningly powerful, it might have limited metacognition, and we should bear that in mind when we begin to take advice from artificial systems, because illusions of confidence in artificial systems might engender over-eager delegation to AI. Thank you very much.
Grazie Steve per questa bellissima.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Given that we are running a bit late, my proposal is the following, to circulate the microphone. So should you have questions, please raise your hands. There is a question over here and another one over there. I'll be asking the question in Italian. Yes, please, in Italian. My question concerns the psychological and educational way in which you can apply metacognition in the field of education. You already hinted at the fact that there is a sort of informal learning of metacognition. And so I'm wondering whether it could be useful thinking of techniques to implement in the educational system, for instance, when you are assessing or testing students, so as to make students more aware of this concept of metacognition, and whether this could be beneficial to reduce the various biases, such as the gender gap you mentioned for STEM disciplines that may bring to women being least confident when choosing or selecting the subject they'll study.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a really important area to develop metacognitive interventions, to develop ways of bringing metacognition into the classroom. And there have been efforts along those lines. I think one thing that's missing is, partly because it's very hard to do these studies, is to measure the impact of whether trying to train metacognition, trying to improve it, will actually have a benefit over the long term. So that's an unanswered question. We don't know whether that's possible, but I think it's really important to try. And I think the other aspect of your question is whether doing so might have another benefit, and that's removing some of the biases that seem to arise from differences in self-belief. And what's very interesting there is that there have been some recent large-scale studies, one carried out in France recently, showing that these gender differences in confidence in subjects like mathematics arise very early in primary school. So only after a few months of the first year of school, you can detect them. And that poses a challenge, because when then can you intervene and shape it? But I think as a first step, making children more aware of what metacognition is, how it works, what things they need to pay attention to realize when they might be wrong, when they might be right, and providing feedback on how their confidence aligns with their performance. All of those things would be great to investigate further.
There is a question over there. I have two questions. One concerns what you said before about self-awareness being a product of the education that children receive. If children were not educated in this field, would they not develop this function? And to what an extent is self-awareness connected to language learning? If we were not self-aware, would we have developed language as a species?
Yes, very interesting question. So perhaps the first one on how self-awareness is learned. So I didn't mean to suggest that you need to have formal education to have metacognition. We think that that's not the case. We think that metacognition develops naturally if you are part of a social group. So almost all of us, if we have a social group when we're growing up, whether these are parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, whoever is bringing you up, will provide that informal cultural and social environment to promote the development of metacognition. And how that then connects to other features of higher cognition like language is very interesting, and there are signs that children who develop metacognition earlier also tend to use first-person pronouns, saying, I did this or I did this. And that's, I mean, I remember when my kids were 1, 2 years old, they would often talk about themselves in the third person. So they would say, my son is called Finn, and he would say, Finn does this, Finn does that. And so there's this transition that psychologists have been aware of for a long time, where children transition into using the first person pronoun, saying I. And there seems to be some connection between that transition and the acquisition of self-awareness. But that is just a correlation. So it could be a coincidence. It's very hard to test the causal link between language and metacognition.
Vediamo se ci sono altre domande dal pubblico, ma anche se ci sono
Are
domande da
there
casa.
further questions from the audience in the room or from our people connected online? There is one here. Is there an optimum value of self-awareness? In particular, can an excess of self-awareness have negative aspects or turn into a disorder? Can there be too much self-awareness?
Yeah, so that's interesting, and it's not something I talked about, but one interesting finding from the realm of skilled performance, so in sports, music, when people become very, very good at something, like hitting a golf ball or playing the violin, when metacognition about those skills is quantified, it seems that people actually lose some of the awareness of how they are performing. And asking them to pay attention to how they are performing something. And this was a study of golfers hitting golf balls. When they were asked to attend to how they were swinging the golf club, it actually made them worse at hitting the ball. So there seems to be, for certain areas of life, when we become very skilled, we might not need metacognition anymore. We can just let that unfold. And actually applying it again to ourselves might disrupt our performance. And so this then suggests that metacognition is particularly useful when we're doing new things, when we want to monitor our errors on tasks that we haven't learnt yet. And that's why it's so important in educational settings, for instance. So yes, I think there can be areas where you can have too much self-reflection. And another area that is interesting is the connection between self-reflection and rumination in conditions of depression and anxiety. So we know that people who are more depressed or anxious tend to think about themselves in past situations more than people who are not. And so that self-focus could be detrimental to how you feel about yourself.
Molto interessante anche questo aspetto legato alle patologie.
Very interesting, and this is also connected to psychiatric disease. There is another question there. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I was wondering, some very serious depressive cases, the subject, besides being apathical, is also lacks empathy, does not share other people's happiness or sadness. It is a sort of emotional agnosia. Is this an impairment of the prefrontal cortex, or is there something wrong with their metacognition development?
Yeah, so the question of what is the source of very low mood and the inability to take pleasure in the world, in other people, to empathize with positive experiences is a fascinating question. And I think there may be elements of metacognition in those conditions, but I think the primary driver there is a change in valuation. Like, what do we value? And we know that actually similar regions of the brain that are involved in self-awareness are also involved in subjective value. The values we attach to different experiences. And those are also constructions. So each of us might value different things. And in depression, we tend to value nothing or very few things. And so the focus at the moment in the neuroscience of depression research is to understand those distortions in valuation. And how can you intervene with therapy or drugs or a combination of the two to restore appropriate, more positive values of the world and other people?
Allora, vedo che c'è una domanda da casa.
There is a question from home, which is very interesting, on the Dunning-Kruger effect. The question is this Dunning-Kruger effect recent? Was it always there? Could it be exacerbated in a population? Could it be induced? Could you explain what a Dunning-Kruger effect is, and what is the relationship with the metacognition studies?
Yeah, so the Dunning-Kruger effect is named after two psychologists, Dunning and Kruger, who published a paper in the 1990s with the title Unskilled and Unaware of It. And the idea was that if you have limited knowledge or skill in a particular area, then you also lack the metacognition to know that you have limited knowledge or skill in that area. And I think this is a very attractive idea. It spawned a lot of popular memes on the internet, on Twitter and so on, people calling each other out for having Dunning-Kruger. But I think it's more complex as a scientific phenomenon, as a feature of metacognition. So one aspect of it is simply a statistical reason. So when we tend to rate our own performance, we tend to regress to the mean of those ratings. So we have some prior belief about how we're going to do on a task, and then someone like me will come along and say, how do you think you did? And you tend to take on board the evidence from the task you've performed, but also keep in mind your prior belief about your general ability. And it's been shown recently that a lot of the Dunning-Kruger effect can be explained by this statistical process of combining your prior with your new information. But there is a small aspect of the Dunning-Kruger that does seem to be real. So people who perform worse in particular tasks do seem to have slightly worse metacognition as well. But it's, I think, a smaller effect than people used to think.
Okay. Chiaro. Faccio anch'io una domanda.
I have a question too, if I may, and then I give the chance to somebody else from the audience. It's a follow-up question, because the question on the Dunning-Kruger effect was linked to the idea that if you know little, you don't have many tools to understand what you actually know and what your limitations are. I have a follow-up question. To which extent do you think it's important for you to talk to other people, people who make you realize what your limitations are? So when you have a discussion with them, they'll make you understand that perhaps you don't know some things, or that some arguments you're using have limitations, and perhaps they might induce you to increase your knowledge, to be more knowledgeable about your own arguments. So I just wanted to ask you whether there is any research on that, and also going forward, perhaps here there are no studies. But do you think that the fact that we live more and more in social bubbles where we tend to talk to people who think as we do, don't you think they might impair our metacognition ability?
Yeah, I think these are great questions. And on the first part, absolutely, there is nice research on these illusions of understanding, where if I ask you, for instance, how does a zip work, or how does this aspect of the economy work, like interest rates? You might say, yeah, I know how that works. But then I ask you, go on then, tell me, how does it work? And what's been shown in a number of studies is that when you push people to actually explain things, they realize their gaps in their knowledge. And in the book, I talk about the role of teaching in exposing limitations in knowledge. And I think it's no accident that the university structure is this beautiful combination of research and teaching. So when we teach people, we realize literally almost in the moment what we don't understand, what we do not know anymore. And it's only in that act of teaching others or explaining things to other people that we see those gaps in our knowledge and can seek out new ways of filling them in. And so I think there's an intimate connection between the act of teaching, the act of explanation, and having better metacognition. And then in terms of how that intersects with social bubbles, absolutely. I think if we are talking with others and they will implicitly endorse our view of the world, then there's going to be no reason to try and explain something to them or argue a different position. And so I think we don't yet understand the implications of these new ways of structuring society for self-awareness, but I would hypothesize that splitting into more homogeneous social groups is not going to be good for having awareness of gaps in our knowledge.
Grazie. Ci sono altre domande? C'è una qui.
Are there any other questions? I think there is one here at the front, one at the back, and then one more over there. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for your lecture. I'd like to share my experience, know thyself. Ever since I was 26, first in sports, and then for many years I went to active health centers. And that really benefited me in practicing martial arts, karate, but also yoga, meditation, Zen, as well as other Oriental disciplines. By doing so, I discovered I had developed some skills I would never thought of when I first entered the employment world, because I dropped out of university to start working. So I'd like to hear your take. Don't you think there would be something everybody should experience? Because Oriental studies tend to be more introspective, whilst we in the West tend to focus our studies on matter and external factors. What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And I think the way you put it is a very nice one. I think that the study of metacognition in the lab is a relatively new science, but the practice of metacognition is hundreds, if not thousands of years old. And as you say, has deep links to Eastern traditions in meditation, in taking introspection seriously as something we should cultivate. And I think that you're right, that especially when it comes to more formal aspects of education, as we talked about earlier on, education has often been focused on developing skills we can measure that seem practical in a variety of topic areas, knowledge areas, skill areas. But there's been limited focus on developing these more general capabilities for awareness of how our own minds work. And I think that's partly because, a bit like the example I gave of the conductor of the orchestra, it's hard to see metacognition in action. We can't watch someone and say, yeah, they're engaging in metacognition right now, or they have great metacognition, I can tell. It's a very internal phenomenon. It's hard to measure, it's hard to track from the outside, and yet that doesn't mean it's not vitally important for success in all these endeavors we've been talking about, particularly in engaging with other people and maintaining some intellectual humility about what we do and do not know. So I think, yes, absolutely, it's vitally important to develop better ways of educating metacognition, and one of those ways may well be taking lessons from the traditions engaging in meditation practice and so on. Absolutely.
C'è una domanda là.
There is a question over there too.
Quando ho acquistato il suo libro,
when I bought your book,
di trovare una parte
I thought
legata
I would find
alla propria oggettività cosciente.
Part about conscious proprioceptivity, self-consciousness linked to tendons, muscles, joints, so everything that contributes to self-image in terms of being aware of your own body. So I must say I was a bit deceived by the title of the book. I thought I would find a deep dive of these aspects, whilst I didn't. Don't you think that conscious proprioception is important?
Absolutely. Sorry you were deceived by the title. Yes, it's a difficult... self-awareness has many definitions, and this is part of the problem with studying it, is that there's many ways into it, and one definition we have in the lab is this combination of bodily perception using things like the mirror test, and also this awareness of mental function. And the line of research that is studying bodily perception, like using the mirror test, also, as you say, involves body image, this map we seem to have of our body in space, so the role of proprioception, sensing the positions of our joints, of interoception, sensing features of how our heart and our lungs and our gut is functioning. So I absolutely think that that's an important part of bodily perception, and this may, under a broad definition of self-awareness, be a key part of how we know our own bodies. But what I wanted to focus on in the book was the science of metacognition, which was more about how we are aware of our own minds. But I think, yes, in terms of the broadest definition of self-awareness, body image, and how that works in the brain is vitally important.
Prenderei l'ultima domanda che ho già visto là, che mi sembrava giusto.
I would take one final question over there.
Sì, volevo sapere se avete fatto degli studi.
Have you carried out any studies on
vissuti traumatici?
On the metacognition as related to previous traumas?
Scusa, io non ho capito la fine della domanda.
La domanda è se ci sono.
Let me try and rephrase the question. Have you carried out any studies that focused on metacognitive abilities in people who experienced traumas?
No, we haven't. And I think one of the difficulties there is deciding on the right population to study and thinking about what is it about previous trauma that might be most relevant for changes in metacognition. So there is a literature seeking to understand links between current mental health as measured now and metacognition. And so we do see that people, for instance, who have generalized anxiety or who have particular a compulsion or intrusive thoughts, they have changes to how they experience their own skills and abilities. They see themselves differently. But this is measuring links between mental health now and metacognition now. And what hasn't been done, as far as I'm aware, is tracking people from the point at which they experience a trauma or an adverse life event and then seeing how that predicts changes in metacognition. And that hasn't been done.
Allora, grazie mille Fleming.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for being with us.
Grazie a tutte e a tutti per aver partecipato.
And giving us his presentation.
Tecnici, insomma, siamo riusciti
Despite some technical impediments, we managed to go through the end.
Per ascoltare la conferenza del Nobel, Sergio Roche, di rimanere seduto.
And by the way, if you want to listen to the Nobel laureate, Professor Roche, you don't need to go out, just stay seated where you are.